Yeah, what I was saying was, did the issue of corporate sector staff themselves being affected, and because of that affects the business, that staff can't come to work, their own families are affected. So, there is a direct impact for the corporate sector. And how is that playing into the approach the corporate sector is taking? Have you seen any difference there? And my second point was about small and medium enterprises. And I've seen this in many places during the post-tsunami response in Sri Lanka, in India, in Indonesia, and various other humanitarian responses where the effort that local businesses, shopkeepers, small, medium enterprise do never gets recognized, never gets documented. And in some situations, it could be even more than what we as international agencies claim to do. So is there any evidence, any data available that could help nurture that relationship? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Other questions?
Hi, my name is Mariana. I'm a student of development at LSE. My only question was, I guess, to the two gentlemen, is whether you observed stakeholders, the people actually being affected by the crises, did they perceive the private sector initiatives differently to the third sector initiatives, and whether that was a significant difference?
Right. Sorry, do we have Tanya? You're challenging the outside questions.
So we have some questions online.
Yep.
So from Martin McCain from Red R UK, he asks, is there any particular phase of disaster response where the private sector risk models makes them inappropriate? A question from Gail Nudorf from the Canadian Red Cross. Should there be similar requirements for businesses to meet charitable law requirements or similar legislation and transparency in the same way that NGOs are required to?
Thank you. That's fine for now. I think otherwise we'll forget what we were asked in the first place. Two very good points, I think, at the beginning on about staff affected and whether that affects the business. Is there anything in the research and the data point as well, anything that supports that kind of impact? And also, I think the second part was also for you, which is whether we can measure and evaluate the contribution of SMEs.
I think, Steve, if
okay.
And let me get to the second bit.
Okay, sure. Well, let me just jump in there first with the gentleman's question from the Humanitarian Leadership Academy. I think this question of corporate staff actually being themselves affected by disasters is one of the main entry points for businesses into these issues. I mean, that's where they first enter this topic and think, wow, this really does affect us because we just lost 80% of our workforce because of a tsunami, because of an earthquake, and so on. So how are we going to make sure that we protect our staff, that we can communicate with our staff during crises, and so on and so forth? So that's a powerful element of this. And actually, I think even taking it a step further, one of the things that's kind of exciting to think about is for businesses. It's not just about businesses helping the people at large, but businesses themselves, especially larger enterprises, by working not only with their tens of thousands of employees in some cases, in the case of Accenture in the Philippines with the 30,000 employees, but elsewhere, by working with their employees, by working with their employees' families, their households, by working with their suppliers and customers up and down the supply chain. Really, businesses can already have a massive impact that really extends deep into many of the countries and locations in which they're working. So I think that's a very important part of it. And a lot of the contingency plans and thinking that businesses have done to protect their own operations and to protect their own staff in the event of natural disasters is an amazing jumping off point as we start thinking about resilience and disaster risk reduction and so on. I mean, some of the examples, for instance, from West Africa, where we see large multinational banks working with the smaller banks that form their backbones in West Africa, that they rely upon to move money in and out of the region. We see these multinational banks then working with their local counterparts so that their operations aren't affected by those banks' IT systems and security and everything else collapsing as a result of a disaster or a crisis. So that's a very long-winded answer, but we have too many questions, so I'll cut it off there for now.
Randolph, you're going to answer on SMEs. And data.
Quite. Well, let me put it this way. Can I just quickly dodge that for a second and say that I think, if I may, this question about the impact and differentiated impact between aid agencies and companies, which I apologize, Anne, except let me just quickly jump into that for a second. I think one of the transformational things you're going to see in this whole discussion is where insurance companies fit in, because this will transform the whole way that I, as a vulnerable person, engage with a private sector. And I think that is something that might be really worth looking at. And to that extent, I'm sure they'll need unbelievably good data.
Helena, you had something to say on data.
Yes, the last time I was in this room was at the launch of the report on non-state donors. And I think we all concluded after that report that, no, we have no idea how much the private sector is giving, whether it's in kind or in cash. And that's just for the multinationals, really. So for the SMEs, I think we have a very, very weak database. Now, in the Philippines, again, the government tried to set up a tracking system to track also corporate contributions from the Filipino business community, and it didn't really get off the ground. OCHA is now collaborating with an initiative in the US of the Foundation Center and the Center for Disaster Philanthropy to try and set up a corporate aid tracking system that would initially focus on the US, and if it works, let's see if we can take it wider, because frankly it's a huge problem that we are unable to capture and recognize and value the fantastic contributions that both SMEs and other private donors give.
Okay, thanks very much. Which of you wants to answer the question about whether there's a particular phase of emergencies at which risk models would be relevant from the private sector? I think you've partly answered that by the insurance company point. Anyone else got anything to say about that?
I won't actually answer your question. I'll answer a separate question because I don't think it's so much of a phase. Because I think we see a huge role in the preparedness DRR phase. We see a huge role in the response. And we see a huge role in the recovery. I mean, so I think there aren't that many phases within humanitarian operations where the private sector doesn't have a major role to play. I think the issue comes down in my mind. I'd be interested to hear the audience's perspective and everyone else's perspective, but it comes down to issues and sectors. There are certain areas where we simply where there may be less scope for businesses to get involved. And here I'm talking about issues such as protection, issues such as human rights, issues such as survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. I mean, issues where the humanitarian community has a unique degree of trust, a unique degree of experience, and so on, that those are areas where we probably won't see that much private sector engagement.
And anyone want to say anything about being subject to charity law? Just to bear in mind again, depending on the size of the company, there are quite tight regulations, including the UK Bribery Act and others, which and even listing on a stock exchange, which require quite a lot of transparency and behavioural challenge.
Sorry, I think that's a question that Helena would answer. But
one part of, I mean,
yes,
yeah, I probably have a different angle because I am not familiar with UK law despite being British, but having lived here for 20 years. But I would say one thing that, it's not just about local laws and company laws and charitable laws, etc. There are also the standards of those entering into the partnership. And here I would say the UN, as you rightly pointed out, in the 80s, there were some rapacious examples of collaboration in the development area between business and development actors, which ended up being all one-sided. But I think the UN has imposed on itself some very stringent guidelines in the last 5 years about which business entities it will not categorically allow collaboration with. We are not allowed to collaborate with manufacturers of cluster bombs. We are not allowed to collaborate with manufacturers of landmines. We are not allowed to collaborate with anyone involved in child labour abuse. And I can carry on, there's a long list, sanctions busting, etc., etc. And that is an important element to this debate about standards and about protecting the integrity of the humanitarian endeavour. Over to you, Randolph.
Is that all right? Sorry, because there's a link between, I think, Steve's answer and yours that I'd just like to mention, because here's part of the whole issue of what is, you talk about small and medium, et cetera. Well, I remember when I was in Somalia, one of the things that we did was to set up separate agreements, separate arrangements with small and medium-sized delivery companies that were private sector that actually we needed to deliver assistance in areas that, so to speak, World Food Program and other agencies couldn't get to. So again, this is part of the complication of this very issue that you're talking about. And if I may, Steve, one of the things that we've also found is that the private sector is getting more and more engaged in conflict areas. And I don't mean, sort of gross, if you like, efforts to provide military with assistance, if you see what I mean, but rather it is, we have to work there too. And I think this is an area that might be worth exploring even more, in case you're looking for another project.
Yeah. Thanks very much. Maybe we could take a couple of questions online first, Tanya, before we open up again in the room.
We Colarvo from Christian Aid. They asked, do you think NGOs could become shareholders in the doing good for-profit businesses? And how do you imagine the place of private sector, from Lawrence Herve, how do you imagine the place of private sector in development of innovations for humanitarian workers? What's the relationship and what's the potential?
Could you say that again? Sorry.
Sure. That's how do you imagine the place of private sector in development of innovations for humanitarian workers? What's the relationship and what's the potential?
Okay. That's probably one for you, Wasa. Other questions?
Hi, Henry Hall from Critical Resource. I was just wondering, other than protecting their own employees, what do you think were some of the other key drivers for why the private sector sought to become involved in humanitarian action?
One there at the back.
Henri-Pierre Koubaka, I'm a journalist. In one of your recommendations, you are talking about helping the private sector and aid agencies understand one another in a setting where a lot of times the private sector in West Africa, which I know best, where the private sector is accused of tax avoidance and or tax evasion. How does that work? How does it work when all of a sudden a former British prime minister visits an African country and all of a sudden there's a reshuffle of the government and we start seeing that some of the new jobs kind of lead towards the organization of some former. So how do you build around there? What's your take on it? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Okay, let's go with those and the potential for shareholdings by NGOs in third sector or profit. I think it was business for good.
Yeah, I mean, if they're private individuals who are owners in private companies, that's I don't see that there's a conflict of interest there.
On some level, I wonder if there is a risk. 'Cause I think one of the great things about certain private enterprises is the fact that they bring a new mentality, they bring a new approach, they bring a new style of operating. And sometimes I wonder if maybe they do become shareholders actually in businesses, does that detract on some level? Or if they become too closely involved with the businesses engaging in this area, does this perhaps pull them too much into the area of conventional ways of thinking and operating, and do we lose some of that originality? So I think there's this question about how do we ensure that businesses engaging in this sector are informed by and aware of humanitarian issues without being too stuck in the mud with some of the bureaucratic and institutional and cognitive elements and strictures within the aid community.
Thank you. And Was, I was going to ask you about the question about innovation.
So what was the question exactly?
Even though I heard it twice, I'm not sure I totally understood it, but I think it was the role of the private sector in innovation, which also appears in the report.
And I would say that it's the role of the private sector in our case is to partner with the humanitarian actors and to work together towards a common goal and for the common good.
But I think in the report, if I'm right, then you placed a particular emphasis on innovation and thought it was more promising. The private sector was more promising for innovation, perhaps, than the humanitarian agencies themselves. Is that fair?
I think it's not an either-or question. I think that they both innovate, and I think that I know a lot of people in the aid community are kind of deeply insulted by this notion that the private sector innovates and we're just kind of implementing cogs of donor governments. So I think they both innovate. I mean, UNHCR, UNICEF, have incredible innovation centers and projects going on. We have the Humanitarian Innovation Program. We have all of these the Humanitarian Innovation Fund, and all of these different initiatives. So they both innovate, and I think that for businesses, though, innovation is a matter of survival or not. So I think they have different approaches to innovation that the aid community needs to learn from. They have a lot more resources for innovation and research and development than aid agencies will ever have in their entire budgets. So I think that this is an area where they need to collaborate. And as Randolph mentioned, one of the recommendations is that let's just start to do it together. Let's in the picture up there of the hackathon, let's start to have aid workers and businesses come together to work on R&D, and not in Geneva necessarily or London, but in Silicon Valley or in Boston or New Delhi for biotechnology and pharmaceuticals, and things along those lines, so that it's not happening remotely, it's not happening ad hoc and here and there, but so that we actually focus on it and invest in it.
Can I just add to that?
Please.
No, I think what you're saying is right, and it's probably the approach we should have had from the beginning, because we come from the pure private sector, and if we had been engaged with more deeply involved with an aid organization to start off with, really collaborating, then I think it might have been easier also, because we would have the culture, communication, everything would have been already ironed out. So I think.
I'm sorry, I'll stop talking after this, but I think that a company like Google actually has a really good approach towards something like this, where they work with aid agencies, they're informed by aid agencies, they understand how things work now, they understand the objectives, but at the same time, when it actually comes down to doing the innovation and developing the technology and delivering on it, they do tend to be a little bit more standoffish about direct collaboration with the aid agencies. So they get to be informed by the aid community, but not necessarily beholden to it, which I think is a fine balance, but I think they've done a pretty good job of striking it.
On the motivation of the private sector for getting involved, I think Wasa gave a bit of an answer herself, saying had she been involved in the first place, her own enterprise might have been a bit smoother. Anyone else on the panel like to say anything about business motivation? I'm resisting jumping in myself.
Can I ask a question to the chair? And that basically there was someone who, so to speak, just raised this question of becoming shareholders, this common good thing. I just wonder, to what extent could I, as a shareholder representing an NGO, actually be able to have influence, be able to speak, be able to guide as a shareholder in a corporate sense, a minority shareholder indeed, but to what extent does a shareholder influence?
Well, I think you'll all be very familiar with the activist shareholders who turned up at AGMs and ask extremely awkward questions, which I think is very valuable. I think both at Standard Chartered and at Tullow Oil, which is the other company I'm involved with, we have had activists, not individuals, actually most of them would be affiliated to an NGO of some kind, saying, you know, what's your attitude to the Dalits in India? You know, how many do you employ? And something for which our CEO was not prepared, I have to say, didn't have the stats to hand. So there's the direct, the open meeting. But otherwise, I think shareholders vote with their feet. Mostly people either sell their shares or buy their shares on their valuation of the company. And obviously there are big corporate conglomerations of shareholders which tend to be very dominant. But as a minority shareholder, I think you're more likely to be heard if you want to engage, if you want to write in, if you want to get an answer to a question. A bit like an MP, you know, once you write in as a constituent. But I think the extent to which day-to-day management and executive power is influenced by shareholders, its strategy, I think, and the direction of the company, and especially if the company is perceived to be doing something wrong in the media. That's very important, I think. Sorry, we had one more question, which thank you for breaking the consensus and for reminding us of that sometimes the activities of private sector advisors and players is not always positive. I think the whole question of tax avoidance and so on is important, but I think more generally the question of what happens when there's bad behavior, how does that fit into your paradigm?
I like the question of tax avoidance, though, because it's a question of, is it legal or is it not? And I think that's an interesting question. If a company is, I mean, let's look at a lot of the companies we're talking about here. A lot of the multinational corporations. I mean, we're like, just pick up the newspaper, and I won't list names, but I mean, companies are employing very creative and very legal strategies to avoid their tax obligations. And does that mean that we should rule out Facebook and Google and many of the companies around the world because they employ these strategies from humanitarian action or not? And I'm not taking any position on that. But I think it's an interesting question for individual aid agencies to consider. But it's an area where, it's a fine line, I guess, between breaking the law and being irresponsible.
But I think you remind us of one of the points in the report, which it's the terms on which the private sector engage. That's important. And I would also say transparency is very important. If you know what people are saying and what they're doing and it's published, then you have a starting point. Okay, next round of questions. Front here.
Hello, my name's Julian Schrodecki from World Vision. I was thinking about a question which is kind of similar to what Stephen was just talking about what we can expect from potential corporate partners. So the idea from an NGO perspective of what a humanitarian actor is getting better and better defined in terms of neutrality, impartiality, those kinds of things. And I'm wondering what the implications are of a bigger role for business in humanitarian action at field level, when by nature often you have to have political affiliations, for example, to own a business in some of the contexts where we work. That's even outside of conflict situations. So I'm just wondering about that in terms of what does this mean for our historic values of impartiality, neutrality, etc.
Elizabeth Blunt, IRIN News. It's one for Wassa. You said that you thought if you'd been involved with NGOs right from the beginning, you'd have had fewer communication difficulties. I wondered if you could give us some examples of the way you found it difficult working as a private sector person with the NGOs.
I'm Fiona Napier. I'm an independent consultant in Nairobi. We haven't had much discussion here about the role of donors. I'm thinking particularly institutional donors in bringing businesses and NGOs together to work more effectively on humanitarian action. So I was just interested in any comments, and during the course of your study, are you finding that an increasing trend? Certainly there's a lot of work, as we all know probably in this room, around longer term strategies of involving business, markets for the poor and so on, where donors have played a key role in getting Vodafone to develop what became M-Pesa, which is now 20 million customers across East Africa and rising. So my original question, it's kind of a little bit of a counterpoint to the colleague from World Vision, is so the role of Western, largely at the moment donors, but not just Western, other donors, governmental donors in forcing NGOs and private sector to work together more effectively on humanitarian response.
Maybe one from...
Sure. One question from Tim, a journalist. He says there's information that there's trillions of unspent profit sitting in the accounts of private sector companies. Could that money be used to fund forgotten crises, or should businesses just look for new business opportunities?
Right, expectations of a business partner, especially at field level, and the question of political affiliation. Who wants to answer that? Anybody?
Yeah, thank you. And I think, there are all sorts of ways of never getting invited back again, and I think I'm just about to embark on it. Because basically, I think your point about principles, if you like, neutrality, impartiality, I think is deeply important, but I think it really has to be contextualized. I'm not sure, as we begin to take a look at where this sector is going in the 21st century, and dare I say, who is this sector in the 21st century, that we can assume that our principles, our standards, etc., really will have value for a very large proportion of the world. And so I put that in that context. So I'm not sure that, in a sense, we'll be able to keep translating our assumptions across the globe. I think the other thing, if I may just say, that the difficulties of working with the private sector is really very, very interesting, because basically I think it goes back to what this whole discussion is about. And I think we have to change the way we actually engage. And I think that is, for me, the fundamental bottom line of, I think, our efforts and our report. So that is where I'm now. But there are a couple of other very good questions that were.
Yeah, but we'll come back to that.
Yes. Just to add on that, I think I agree with Randolph, it's important to contextualize, but I also think part of what OCHA has to do in its role is to steer the conversation between the different stakeholders around these issues. And we are recognizing that the state of humanitarian response in the 21st century involves many, many, many actors who don't always share the same perspective, and they don't always share the same operating principles, let alone the same end point interests. But what we have to do while we exist is, as the UN, is to stand up for the principles that really do matter in certain contexts. And I think Steve highlighted that there are settings, protection, human rights, SGBV, etc., where there are some very, very, very clear red lines that we would not want any collaborator, whether they're commercial or third sector or anybody, to cross. And that as the sort of traditional custodians, I guess, as we, the international NGOs and the UN family are, of traditional humanitarian response, we need to stand up for those red lines and also try and promote understanding about them. And that's why I think these consultations around the World Humanitarian Summit are so important, because we're trying to build a shared understanding, not just around our operating principles, but around how we collaborate, how we innovate together, how we support each other's interests while achieving a common objective.
Quick one on difficulties, Elizabeth's question of what difficulties you found in practice.
Well, first of all, we have been working with NGOs from the start. It's just we haven't had that tight cooperation that we would have liked to have. We had a lot of feedback initially on the product from, for instance, Oxfam from Haiti, etc., that we acted on. But other issues that we've seen is working with UN in particular with procurement processes that are very, very heavy. And on top of everything, they require 3 years of profit. So already there you have a contradiction. Working with NGOs, I mean, a lot of the NGOs, they ask for references, in particular with an innovation like ours, which is a good thing. But then at the same time, we're not invited to participate and be able to do independent evaluations or when there are evaluations done, it's not possible to share them with others. So that's also a difficult one. And then also going back to donors, sometimes we see that there are issues linked to the fact that the organizations are funded and they have donors putting requirements on them on how to a certain type of product should be bought or a certain kind of reporting should be done. So that also limits them. And there might also be a fear from the NGO side, either for personal reasons, they're risking career. There are a lot of project employments and short-term employments within the NGOs, but then also to risk not receiving funding next time round. So there are a lot of things we haven't understood. And also to apply for funding from some of the large organizations like USAID is very, very complicated for us. We don't have the vocabulary even to do so.
Anything else on the impact of donors' private sector strategies on?
Thank you. Yeah, and I'd just like to mention, I think one of the problems, if you take a look at all the work that Steve and I and our colleagues have done, I think one of the gaps has been what you might call state capitalism. If you take a look at who actually, who are the largest corporations in the world, I think the top 13 or 14 are state capitalist structures. And this leads into, by state capitalist structures, where does government fit in? And what does government control? And who determines, if you like, how a state capitalist, if you like, entity engages? So I think that also, Steve, that's our next study.
Well, I was just going to build on it also, switching over to the question of the donor and the government question. Alongside the state capitalism, I think that we also found that many times where businesses got most involved in humanitarian crises was actually at the urging of national governments. And so I think governments have a key role to play in this, both in formal terms, in terms of encouraging their NGO implementing partners to consider working with the private sector and drawing upon the private sector in the course of operations in some cases, though frankly NGOs and UN agencies don't need another round of conditionalities and checklists and all that for their work. But that's one side of it. But there's also, when US companies responded to the tsunami in 2004, and when they responded to the earthquake in Haiti, the U.S. government and the U.S. presidents had a huge role in encouraging that. In the case study of Jordan, one of the things we actually saw was that the government had a huge role in discouraging businesses from contributing to aid agencies focused on Syrian refugees because they were afraid it would draw the businesses' charitable giving and zakat away from needy Jordanians and shift it entirely to Syrian refugees. So governments they set the tone for a lot of these issues. But that's especially on the CSR side and on the kind of charitable side and not so much on the commercial side, which is the most interesting. And
thanks very much.
One very brief point on that. I think institutional donors need to play a more active role in promoting business engagement with humanitarian and vice versa. But they also need to play a strong role in catalyzing efforts around transparency, due diligence, integrity, and accountability in such collaboration, because they're the ones who are funding all of us. And they have a ability to influence how we live up to accountability, integrity, transparency standards in our collaboration with the business community. And that also answers a little bit your point on the kind of West Africa tax evaders, that we need to stand up to these to specific standards in how we work. And I think the donor community both needs to promote closer work, but also ensure standards in it.
Yeah, thanks. I must say too that I think that the private sector strategies of donors are sometimes as ill-informed and need as much education as for NGOs more widely. I think almost every government now is trying to find its private sector side in its aid program, but it doesn't actually have the skills or experience to properly participate in that dialogue. So I think the kind of mutual understanding and learning about each other and developing proper relationships applies equally to government departments struggling with these issues. Unless there's another really burning question, I think we probably should draw this session to a close with okay, one burning question. Okay, two burning questions. That's
I was keeping very quiet. I can say something.
Sorry.
Okay, that's three short contributions before we wrap up.
Hi, I'm James. I work for something called Hack for Good, and you were talking about hackathons before. 12th to the 14th September, we're running a hackathon with around 6,000 people worldwide in 113 different cities, so it's not just remote. And we've got most of the major global charities on board. We're talking to government. We also have Google as a sponsor. So we're trying to do quite a lot of things. And we had a workshop on Monday where we brought them all together, going through different challenge statements. So I think we're doing most of your recommendations already, but who can we talk to from you?
Okay, we'll catch you afterwards, and I hope everyone here in the room will be able to stay to continue the conversation and also have some refreshments after we close.
Great. Nancy Wilson, Relief International. It strikes me that that maybe the title is a bit of the problem, because it's not necessarily the businesses that you're just talking about in general, right? The private sector name. And I think it's really important to peel that apart, because some of the private sector contribute to the very problems we're out to try and address. And certainly climate change would be one area of that. And so I think really discerning between the roles and ways in which companies can really contribute their skills and talents is very important. So just as we don't want to write off the private sector, we also don't want to write in all of the private sector at the same time. And I think it's so important. You mentioned about this technical capacities. And I think that whole area of distribution infrastructure and supply chain and logistics, I know in the United States, involving UPS has been a major piece in the humanitarian aid area. And those kinds of things, just really capitalizing. So it's more of a comment really than a question here at the end.
Great. Thanks very much. And you have the last word.
Hi, my name's Helen McElhinney. I'm a humanitarian advisor at DFID. And I first of all want to acknowledge that it's quite striking that I am the designated official that's been sent from the humanitarian team as opposed to the private sector development team, unless one of my colleagues is sneakily at the back. So first of all, to welcome the report. Obviously we're quite involved and very much in support, and looking forward to digesting the many findings. I think it's fascinating. I'm glad it's on the agenda for the World Humanitarian Summit. I think we are so far from getting to grips with this agenda. It's exciting to hear what OCHA and others are already doing, but there are gaps in our existing multilateral system that I think OCHA, for example, have. On the SERF front, for example, we haven't seen as much private sector giving into some of the funds that have been really effective in the past. We've seen the rollout of the new humanitarian programme cycle recently, but not sufficient attention on how we do reach out to the chambers of commerce in country and whatnot. I'd also be really excited to see the terms of reference of new humanitarian coordinators going into particularly level 3 emergencies and sort of tier 2 emergencies, to be asked to map the local capacities of of private sector in those contexts, and to work with them to be ready when disasters do inevitably hit. I think the natural disasters can play. We can learn a lot there. The critical gap will be in translating that over to where the majority of our resources are, which are fragile, conflict-affected states. And so, yes, exciting to hear the possibilities in Somalia and other places, but I think that's going to be a real challenge to get to grips with.
Thanks very much. That's a great contribution, a great way to finish a very good and useful conversation. Thank you very much for the report, Randolph and Steve. Thank you, Helena and Wassa, for joining us. And thanks everybody in the room and online for helping to make it, I think, a really useful afternoon. There'll be a video available in a few days, and the report itself is already online. So please do join us if you can, and thank you again for coming.